I suppose I better be honest about the Magic Flute. I've spent my life avoiding conducting it. I conducted the Da Ponte operas an enormous amount, Idomeneo an enormous amount. I have a sense of self-preservation because, in fact, the piece is a conductor's graveyard. And I've heard so many people find it very, very difficult. I had an unforgettable experience with the one person in my experience who did not find it difficult. In Glyndebourne, there were 16 performances in a season of Zauberflöte. The first 8 conducted by a really excellent conductor who got into terrible trouble. And in the middle of the run, Bernard Haitink came to take over. And he said, no, I don't want a lot of rehearsal, but I would love to have one rehearsal with the orchestra and everyone on stage. And he came in at 10 o'clock in the morning, smiled, said good morning to everybody, raised his arms, and the whole piece just glowed and fitted as though he'd been working on it for months. And I thought at that point, that's what a great conductor is. But part of the truth is, it requires two very, very different things. One is it's very hard to be simple, and you absolutely must be simple in this piece. But also, because often the piece seems simple, you have to really use your imagination, and you have really to make the courage to say, okay, this is another character from the bars before. In that way, it's much more similar to Haydn. And in fact, for me, I hear the Schöpfung and I hear Fidelio. I hear those pieces being born. But the character of it is such that if you don't get the pronunciation right, you're in trouble. If you play anything which is normal, anything which is unphrased, the piece just can get away from you. And of course, he was writing for a number of different audiences. But Haydn was much more of a country person. You know, Mozart was really a city, sophisticated person. But there is more of the country in this piece, more of country music and more of natural feeling than in most of his works. And the other amusing thing is most of the pieces that were performed by Schikaneder in what was then this little theatre in the sticks. I mean, now Theater an der Wien, it's in the same place. It seems to me to be right in the centre of Vienna, but that was a suburb then. It was a very different audience than he was used to at court. And you had to write really low down country and Western music as well. And most of Schikaneder's operas were group compositions. So, for instance, the first Tamino was also one of the composers. And a couple of years earlier, Mozart had been involved in a group opera called, I believe, The Philosopher's Stone, and he'd written a couple of numbers in this. There were about 10 composers involved. And part of, I think, what he was doing in the Magic Flute was saying, we don't need 10 composers. I can be 10 composers. What style of music do you want? I will write it. I'll write you that. I will write the most extraordinary Bach or even Schumann's second with the armed men. I'll write you an aria like I used to write in Idomeneo for the tenor. Da, 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 da. What do you want? I'll do it for you. Oh, and by the way, I'll invent Wagnerian recitative in the scene for the Sprecher and Tamino, where nobody had written anything like that before. Mozart had never tried anything like that. And it was the one part of the opera that Wagner absolutely adored, of course, because it predicted him. He loved anything that predicted him. What can you say? And a recitative that is so extraordinarily put together. It's every 4 bars is orchestrated differently. Everything goes with the mood. In fact, Mozart, who didn't call it a Singspiel, he called it a grand opera, which was also a new phrase. He was trying to invent a new type of music theatre, a kind of total music theatre where everything would be linked together. And he would have done it, and he died 2 months later. What can you say? Fate is often not kind. I had an interview the other day with a really very nice journalist. They do exist, you know. And she asked me, why are you doing in your new festival such a repertoire piece as the Magic Flute? And I was surprised. I had kind of started up and I thought, oh, is any piece a repertoire piece? And then I thought, you know, there are some pieces which are so brilliantly successful and so popular immediately that people tend to forget how extraordinary they are. In England, we have this with Shakespeare's Midsummer Night's Dream, for instance. People tend to say, oh no, not another production of that. And then whenever you see it, you're completely begeistert, as we say in English. The Schubert Unfinished Symphony is another one of them. I mean, there are many great works of art that are so familiar. But let's not forget what a raging masterpiece the Magic Flute is, and how different it was from anything anybody had done before, even Mozart. And of course it was the piece that made him almost a household name. There's a real irony that the first performance was just over 2 months before his death. But when one thinks that performances were put together very, very quickly, that in the first month of its life it had had 20 performances in the Theater an der Wien, where it was premiered, only in the first month. By 1795, there had been 200 performances in the same theatre. You could see it almost every night if you wanted somewhere around Vienna. Mozart conducted the first couple of performances himself, but then went to many others and was often seen to be taking over the Glockenspiel part and driving Schikaneder, who had written the libretto and was singing Papageno, driving him absolutely crazy. Some years later, in 1815, a group of musicians who'd played the first performances came together to talk about what it had been like in one of the big music journals. And they told a story of Mozart yet again going on the Glockenspiel and simply playing it every time Schikaneder wanted to say something. And finally Schikaneder said the immortal words, "Shut up, Mozart!" Because in fact he was furious, because it was actually when Mozart did this, it made the audience realize that actually he was not playing the Glockenspiel. This was a matter of great pride to him, because in fact the flute was played indeed by the tenor. The tenor who sung the first Tamino was not only a composer but an accomplished flute player. Emmanuel says he's working on the tenor singing, but for once I really don't believe him. But the fact that a piece can be so immediately popular and immediately part of everybody's life does not mean that it's not a masterpiece and profound as well. It surprised me, knowing how much opera the orchestra has played, to find out actually that these are the first live performances of the Magic Flute in the history of the orchestra. Recently, actually, the orchestra say they can't remember when they played the Magic Flute Overture, since people don't play overtures very much, let alone the rest of the piece. It was recorded in the 30s, the first ever studio recording of the piece by Beecham, and also done in the studio by Karajan, but no performances. So we are privileged to be giving the first Berlin Philharmonic performances of this astonishing, funny, moving, profound piece. Mozart was very busy. I mean, that almost goes without saying. But at this time, even more so, because he was desperately short of money. he wasn't particularly well. And so he was in the middle of writing the Magic Flute when the commission for La Clemenza di Tito came, and another secret commission for a Requiem came. And it's extraordinary to think how fast he had to write the Magic Flute. The most astonishing thing is that it was all complete some weeks before, and he went then on to writing Clemenza di Tito, but there was still no overture, and there was still no beginning of the second act. So, 2 days before the first performance, in the afternoon, apparently, he started writing the overture, which we all know. Even more incredible to me is that this was not going to be the overture at all. In fact, he sketched quite a lot of the overture in the time when the piece wasn't called the Magic Flute, but something like the Egyptian Mystery. And it was going to start like this. And then 2 flutes. And then there was a wonderful sounding allegro. Etc., etc., etc. One of the mysteries of this last couple of years is he wrote many, many fragments, mostly for chamber ensembles, and whether these were some things he was writing just for use later, or ideas he had that he couldn't quite work out what to do with, nobody knows. But in fact, having written so many hit melodies one after another in the Magic Flute, the last thing you would expect to do would for him to do what he did, which is to write an overture which has none of the themes of the opera at all, apart from the 3 famous Masonic chords, and to turn out something which basically showed everybody how to write counterpoint. So people forget that is a fugue. In fact, at the time, people made fun of him because Scarlatti had written a sonata which was very, very famous at that time, which went. And they just presumed that Mozart had stolen it. And it's interesting, there's actually not much you can do with that theme in Scarlatti, as when you hear the Scarlatti sonata, you hear it, he gets stuck. And it's extraordinary that Mozart should not only come up with a theme like that, but make part of it piano and part of it forte, as though noble Tamino was struggling with rougher Papageno. So, etc. Fortunately, the orchestra play it better than that. And similarly, the march, the famous. This was written the morning before the premiere. And then I think in the afternoon he went back to finish the overture, which makes one realize that probably the orchestra was sight reading at the first performance. We know they were for Don Giovanni because there's still the story where the players said, well, the ink was still wet. It just literally arrived. People didn't rehearse then. And it's not an easy piece, let's face it. Yeah, what's it all about? There are so many possibilities. Goethe said, it doesn't take very much education to realize that the libretto of the Magic Flute is rubbish. He then said it takes a considerable amount of education to realize that it's extraordinary. Not everybody's agreed with him over the years, and there's always been the problem of who's on what side, what's going on, why does it suddenly all change in the second act? And I must say I'm immensely grateful to Robert Carson, with whom we've just done a beautiful new production in Baden-Baden, for coming up with a simply brilliant idea. And like many brilliant ideas, it is absolutely simple, and one wonders why did not other people think of it. At the beginning of the second half, where in most productions you think, my God, here we are, and so Sarastro, who we thought was the villain in the first half, he's actually the hero. In this production, everybody who is not a young person, or in other words, really, Papageno, Tamino, Pamina, or Monostatos, whoever Monostatos might be, everyone else is in masks and they're in hats. You have no idea who they are. You have no idea what sex they are. So in the second act, when after the first march, everybody meets together in this production right round the front of the pit, when the chords come, people first, they take their hats off, and then you realize that half of the people there are women. Then they take the masks off. And you realize that everybody in the cast, everybody in the story is there. On the second chords, Sarastro walks across to the Queen of the Night and hugs her. And then you realize, they're all in it together. And Robert's solution is that this is a kind of initiation ceremony where the young people simply have no idea what's going to happen. The young people do not know who will be chosen to be which person. So they have no idea. The other people are sworn to secrecy about this, and this is basically the test of how do you grow up. I mean, which so many societies, so-called civilized and so-called primitive, have the same initiation ceremonies. And it makes a great deal of sense of the piece. Also, this very, very powerful idea that, for instance, while the Queen of the Night is telling Pamina to kill Sarastro, that Sarastro is able to watch from the distance. And the Queen of the Night looks at him to see, is she doing okay? And that one of the great and most important things of growing up is to realize that your parents are fallible. I mean, we all know that. But there are some times where your parents say, do something, and you must not do that. And this is part of the test. Even though there is that very chilling statement where they say, what will happen if they don't get through these tests? And Sarastro says, well, they will taste the grace of God earlier than we will. But it makes the story a very, very different one. And it also works extraordinarily well with where the music seems to be honest and where it seems to be play acting. And it still leaves room for a great deal of humor, because it is extraordinary that the only opera that I know of in the repertoire which mentions the word death more than the Magic Flute is Tristan and Isolde. In fact, a lot of this in our production takes place under the ground. Tamino is thrown into a grave at the beginning, which is where he finds an enormous, very realistic-looking python. But all the trials take place underground. So as you see Tamino and Papageno going through the graves in a ladder, then you also see people coming down into the underground. And for once also, it makes it very eerie and very dangerous. Because I always had a problem in other productions that for Tamino and Pamina, really actually to walk through fire and water with Emmanuel playing didn't seem so bad. Whereas actually the scene that Robert has given us is really rather frightening and eerie. But the wonderful thing about the Magic Flute is that there are many thousands of ways of doing it, and the piece not only survives all of them, but somehow enjoys all of them. It's very hard to wreck this piece in any way. And it will carry on being interpreted in myriads of different ways. Both Mozart and Schikaneder gave us room for all these things. It's one of his great gifts is the gift of not saying how it must be.